So this is we're continuing the polemical book of the letters of rabbis from the Hamburg Bezdin. And it's a response to Nogat Tzedek. This is called Eile Divrei Bris. These are the words of the covenant. And this is a response, this is 1818. It's a response to 1819, response to the 1818 book of Nogat Tzedek, which is an early reformer soliciting letters about organs and shoals and a few other questions from Orthodox rabbis who I think he knew would be on his side. And what's interesting about it is that you see it change so much in the 19th century, right? Very early on, these are halachic questions. Is this a problem of playing musical instruments after the destruction of the temple? Is it a problem? Is it how much can you compare it to the Shulchan Aruch's case of having a non-Jew play for bride and groom on Shabbos? What else did he say in there? Those kinds of sort of, he had actually had some other ideas that were sort of surprising. That said, Rabbi Moshe of Kutno and Rabbi Rekanati. And then there was one more. It was something that was surprising to me. So it's interesting. It's not like, remember when we saw Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who was writing in, the 1890s, it's like the enormous thrust of that is just one thing, which is, it's v'halach to be, it's not going in their ways. And it's not strengthening the reformers. That's the bulk of it. I mean, that's what's so clear. And that's, whereas early on, they're treated like halachic questions, even though they're more than that, because they can't really come out and say, oh, the reformers, there's already a sense of enlightenment for sure. But there is no reformation yet. And the early reformers, this is an important note also, I may have mentioned this yesterday, the early reformers are not reformers. They're really too concerned with halacha to be reformers. They're trying to work, they're lahavdil, but it feels like the things that we argue about today within Orthodoxy. Women leaders. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Is that let's talk about the halachic question. Okay, it's hard to argue that it's a halachic problem. Is it a slippery slope? Right? I mean, it doesn't feel very different than that. It's not really a reformation. And so when Orthodox rabbis who are opposed write back, also it's very surprising what they draw on. That they're not early, later on in the 19th century, then it becomes obvious. It's easy to just say, "Are you kidding?" That's reform. But in 1820. It's a whole different story. You have to sort of find reasons to forbid it. You kind of know you shouldn't do it for bigger picture reasons, but you need to make a halakhic argument for it. So they draw on things that you'd be surprised about. Here's one. This is the letter that we were doing in Eile Divrei Bris from Rabbi Herzshire of Mainz. Even the Chassam Sofer, you'll see one right after this from the Chassam Sofer, who you would imagine would be, sort of up in arms about a reformation. But you'll see it's so much more calm than that. I think the Chassam Sofer probably writes more about it later in history. But so are you allowed now? Right, that's the other thing here is that they're not even talking about weekdays. They're assuming that weekday is okay. And that's amazing, right? It's just the Shabbos issue that's even the question in this book in 1819. Can you use a non-Jew to play an instrument on Shabbos for you and Shul? So it says, we all know what the Shulchan Aruch says and what the Ramah says about dancing. We did this already. It gives it two reasons that it's better for them to be shogeg, better for them to be so he tries to compare it to clapping and dancing, which he's kind of arguing was forbidden. It wasn't such a great comparison. I want to scroll down here. Says, that part we did yesterday. So he says, Va'od nirali, here's another reason he gives, right? Yesh b'zeh gam kein geder kedusha kenoda ma demamshech lizi. You can see he's like kind of pulling at things. He wants to find reasons. He's worried about pritzut. He's basically what he's saying here is if there's going to be an instrument in shul, we're worried men and women are going to cavort. How do we know? That comes from the rabbis. Savta bat shatin lekol tabla rita bein l'rav lazar. This is a Gemara that says that when there was music, there was dancing, and the men and women would start. There would be too much dancing together, socializing together. I mean, we know that for the simcha, that the whole concept of machitza comes from the simchas beis hashoeva. The whole concept comes from the Gemara's situation of the joy of the water drawing, where there were men and women too much together, so they created the concept of machitza. It says to beyamim kadmonim hayinogim b'kilatenu leitim rechokim. It says in our community at times in the old days, late nisuin b'nei ashirim, if two rich people got married, the kabel Shabbos beis knesses yeshna b'Shabbos lifnei nisuin or ach nisuin. So there was like an ufra for a Shabbat chatan before or after the wedding, and they would do Kabbalat Shabbat with kli zemer, with instruments. Aboi v'shalom until the end of Mechadodi. But there was a problem. We saw that men and women were together because of that. I don't know. Are they dancing together? It's hard to know exactly what he means by that, unless it's, I don't think that maybe they didn't have a balcony. They had, I don't know. Isn't there a mechitza? It's a little bit funny. Like what exactly? But apparently he's worried that the instruments will create the sort of air of frivolity. And we find that pritzim, those who have no modesty, no morals, will play instruments, and we have to rebuke them. He says for the last 25 years, we haven't done this anymore with the instruments. But why? I mean, you could see how he's trying to draw on something, right? It doesn't really have such a case that it's forbidden. It's so much easier later when you can just say that's reform, or that's Christian. Even though it's obviously Christian now, but they don't really bring that up here. That's what's fascinating. Palanoda, I mean, the organ by this time, by the way, I found a PhD thesis on the organ in Europe in the mid-1700s. And the organ by the mid-1700s makes its way out of the church and into the sort of secular world of music. All the early composers, all the composers from the late 1700s, early 1800s played the organ. And actually even church things become a little bit concerty. The church actually gets very upset because kind of losing control. The church music is becoming secularized. So maybe they're not so worried about it being an imitation of Christianity because it's already, become a concert hall thing. And we know it was used for other things like the birthday of the king. But it's like it's almost like they know something's wrong here, but they got to figure out how to do it, And so he says here maybe we need to forbid it because in shul men and women are going to end up together because of this music. Well, it seems to me, I don't know, that seems like a worry that's unusual. We have to be very careful to draw lines when it comes to these kinds of immorality issues. And he says, you know what? In all of Israel, we've developed a situation in which men and women pray separately in shul. It's sort of funny. I mean, this is the early 1800s. That's like, he's telling us that. I mean, isn't that obvious? As it says in Maseches Sukkah. That's what we just mentioned. Tikkun Gadol Tiknu, Anashal Mata, Nashal Mala. Originally, men and women were together in the Beis HaMikdash for the drawing of the water, and then they created a balcony for the women. That they shouldn't see each other. Now, that's not clear in the Gemara that they shouldn't see each other. Actually, Moshe says they could see each other. V'kalas Rosh, and there would be frivolity. and it could lead to sin. And maybe this is why we haven't had instruments in shul. I mean, that seems like an argument that argument I have not seen before. And then he says, okay, so he summarizes. Hello, Mikol Hanal. What emerges out of this is those who want to be lenient in our generation, the Rabo Hamit Partzim Ba'am. There's an increase of Partzim. They don't have the word reformers yet. Partzim, I assume, refers to enlightenment, those who break through the boundaries. And we have many people who actually violate Shabbos publicly, he says. Right, the enlightenment is already happening. So we should be extra careful not to permit people playing instruments in shul on Shabbos, even if it's a non-Jew, because it's just going to show people that it's going to be, people are going to think, oh, that we could do it. You could violate Shabbos. As the rabbis say, that they're riding on an animal on Shabbos, even though that's a rabbinic prohibition, there was a moment when they got the death penalty because it was such a slippery slope, right? So it's interesting. In a certain sense, the reaction to the Enlightenment is not as powerful as the reaction to the Reform. Once it's a Reform movement, it's much easier to just say, are you kidding, in Oregon? But much harder at this point when people are, as individuals, becoming enlightened. Okay. Now this is from this letter. This next letter is from Rav Moshe Sofer. This is the Chassam Sofer. Now the Chassam Sofer, who said, Chadash asur min haTorah, anything new is forbidden from the Torah. That was his general rule. Now that he probably said that later. I don't think he said that in 1819. But you'll see, right? What you would assume is he'd be on the warpath about assimilation and about not walking in their ways and about reformation. But it's not. It's in a way, I think, because it's too early for that. And the people that he's arguing against are not Enlightenment. The early reformers are not the enlightened people who've just given it all up. The early reformers are coming from a place of halachic argument. That's the thing. They're not really, they're kind of modern. They're not, they're more open-minded Orthodox, really. So he says, there are people that are emerging who don't have a yoke of heaven on them, and they want to nullify the covenant. I'm probably referring here to the name of this book, which is Ele Divrei Habrit, is the words, the covenant. They want new ideas, and that's what they're coming with. And they have shuls, but the shuls are closed all week. On Shabbos, they're open. So I don't know what he's referring to. Now, he's in Hungary, of course, and maybe he's referring to the neologues. I don't know if they're around yet. But I guess that there are these sort of shuls with people who are less religious, maybe more enlightened, and they're not dominating during the week. Umi yachein gam az yiskar delatim. And he says what really we should do is close them on Shabbos also. Why? Because they've changed the prayer service. Now in 1819, this is before the first Hamburg temple is built, but there's already in Berlin sort of a reform minyan. They changed it. From their own hearts, they have added things and they've taken away things. They've left the morning blessings. Maybe it means they took away the morning blessings. Gar in Nusach Tzmichas Karen Dav Mishichenu. They've changed the language of messianic things. and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. It's interesting that they did that early. And they've hired non-Jews to play instruments on Shabbos, which is forbidden. Maybe. I mean, I'm not sure it's forbidden in Shulchan Aruch, but he says that. And they're praying most of their prayers in German. Okay, so this is interesting. I mean, this is already really. I mean, I'm wrong maybe that there's no, about how far things have gone. I mean, this is before the first Reformed Temple, but it sounds like already whatever this minyan in Berlin is, it's doing things that are pretty radical. It's got an organ, and again, it's radical, but it's not radical. You find it in Shulchan Aruch. You could be Orthodox and argue that prayer should be in the vernacular, that you should have it, that you could have an organ. The change in, are we so? Is this such a red flag for us because we live post-reform, and like it wasn't as big a red flag back then? That you would just dismiss it all out of hand. If they changed, some of the language of the prayers. I mean, it's hard to get out of our own shoes in which it's such a red flag because we live after the Reformation. We live in response in a certain way. Orthodoxy, in some ways, today lives in response to the Reformation. Clear Shir B'Yom Shabbos Kodesh Shara Solomon. It says they're using instruments on Shabbos which are forbidden for us. Okay. Elu Kitzer Divrei Pe'er Ma'alatchem B'Yigartchem. You've written a little bit about this in this letter, which you've written me. In other words, he's responding now to this letter from these rabbis in the Hamburg Besdin who are trying to solicit these letters. Manif liyarot gone zman gone pirtzos hador lachavotati gamani hamet. So you want to know, do I agree with you or not, that we should forbid these things? Ma'ashi, what can I answer? Hello, Yadua Umufursam Ki Daniel Ish Chamudot Begola. Daniel said, Zimnin Talata Biamamahu Birach al Berchuhi Umetzali Amora Kodam Allah Kol Kival Di Avid Min Kodam. I'd have to look up this pasuk because Daniel is in Aramaic. I'm not sure exactly what this pasuk is. V'vor mizeh shegam mikdam adina terem shnigzar gzeira mi'akasdim haya mipal shalosh panim b'chol yom b'yom. He's trying to prove that, I guess, Daniel prayed 3 times a day, not just on Shabbos. And the rabbis say, I feel that even when the temple stood, the Jews prayed every day. So he's saying, there you see a proof that we need to pray 3 times a day. And you certainly should pray once a day. I guess publicly means. And I haven't brought a proof from King David who says I prayed at night and day, because maybe you'll say, and maybe he's referring to the Ramban, that prayer is only obligated at a time of difficulty. About Daniel, but from Daniel you can prove that you have to pray 3 times a day. I mean, it's amazing that this is the response to all this: is you have to pray 3 times. Keep their shuls open. It's amazing. Like you can't imagine somebody in the 1890s responding to the reform by saying they don't daven every day. He says, of course we still davened. He's trying to prove we davened even during the time of the first Beis Hamikdash 3 times a day. Okay, we'll continue. I'll stop here. We'll continue with this. But you'll see that his letter actually is very short. It's not what you would expect from the Chassam Sofer. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.